Hi, I'm Bob, and welcome to my channel regarding AD, where it's everything and anything audio description. Been off for a couple of weeks, kind of utilizing the summer break here, as things were calm in some ways and not in others, but I wanted to get back to true to form of kind of describing some things that I'm learning, or maybe at this point I'm not really learning much, but I'm thinking about, and keep a short video on this topic. So the topic I wanted to delve into today is, what is audio description? Sort of, taking a step back from looking at definitions or thinking about what even is this. I think I've struggled to I was going to say describe audio description. That's kind of where my head is at. I feel like I get a bit short-circuited when thinking about what is it. So I thought I'd read a couple of definitions that I'm seeing and finding, but then share a couple of thoughts of kind of where my head's at with what those definitions are and where my brain finds them lacking in some respects. So I've got a couple of different sources here. One is the audio description handbook, the Routledge handbook, that I spent another video going through. In the introductory chapter, Christopher Taylor and Eliza Perego, they summarize a couple of different description or definitions here. So one from the American Council of the Blind, it says, audio description is either live or recorded information provided by a trained describer that provides descriptions of visual components of an event to become accessible to those who are blind or of low vision. So the kind of more operative words in this definition seem to me to be about information. It says that audio description is information, which, with my kind of library school action going on, feels a little bit like a black void, to kind of start off with that assumption that audio description is a certain type of information doing certain things. But that's kind of the basis, I think, of this definition. It's provided by a trained describer. So there's another element where, and the introductory chapter kind of points this out, and there's yet to be a certification body, although there's one coming to sort of look at, what is a trained describer and how can you tell if one is trained. And so therefore, is anything, any audio description or attempts at audio description coming out of somebody or some group of people who aren't trained, it doesn't count as audio description. But that word provide, and then provides descriptions. So I don't like that, the circularness of that, to use the word describe in the definition of audio description. I don't know. I think that's where my brain short circuits. And then the last part, to become accessible to those who are blind or of low vision. And I think that probably is a core component that I'll at least kind of use as a sticky component, because it kind of goes into the nothing about us without us kind of framework for disability studies, in that I would hesitate greatly, and I think there would be lots of concern and caution over kind of like co-opting the definition of audio description to mean something other than being in service of those that it was originally, intended to help, aid, include, make accessible. So I think that kind of terminology of accessibility is key. Of course, I've referenced several times Joel Snyder's work, and in his book, it's called The Visual Made Verbal, and that's another kind of definition. The visual made verbal. Obviously, it's a lot more concise, and and it doesn't quite go into all of the, in service of or for kind of elements of the first. But it definitely takes a more macro view, the visual made verbal. I think it kind of does a nice job at hitting at the translation aspects of what's going on in audio description, versus the first one is it's kind of talking about the end result is information that's doing a certain thing. Of course, it alludes to who it was provided by, but I think the visual made verbal, the sort of the verb there of made, sort of invokes creating and a creation process of which there is translation going from one noun visual to another verbal, and it definitely I think nicely I was going to say paints a picture, but I think I'm getting all my metaphors mixed there. I think it carries a narrative of beginning in one place and ending in another, and I really like it a lot. I think it's really helpful, but at the same time, I think I struggle with saying to somebody that has never heard of any of this before to just say like, audio description, it's the visual made verbal. I think it gets like most of the way there. I'm not like against it necessarily. I want to read briefly, to keep this kind of quick. I want to read briefly some of the kind of like statutes and regulations that are in place around some of this, because I think that's also a critical element at play. Is there are a lot of kind of definitions put into legal documents of which people need to conform to and to hit standards for. And it's just been very interesting thinking about the lack of standards, evidence, and body around what constitutes audio description, such that, who's to say I haven't provided audio description? Who are you to say? It's there, right? It's information. It's information. But real quickly, in the U.S. Access Board Section 508 standards, I'm reading this from the Audio Description Project, their kind of about section. It says audio description, narration added to the soundtrack to describe important visual details that cannot be understood from the main soundtrack alone. Audio description is a means to inform individuals who are blind or who have low vision about visual content essential for comprehension. Audio description of video provides information about actions, characters, scene changes, on-screen text, and other visual content. Audio description supplements the regular audio track of a program. Audio description is usually added during existing pauses in dialogue. Audio description is also called video description and descriptive narration. I'm so glad they threw that in there, because that's what I found when I was doing my library catalog project this past summer. Department of Justice defines audio description in this way. Audio description means the spoken narration of a movie's key visual elements, such as action, settings, facial expressions, costumes, and scene changes. Audio description generally requires the use of an audio description device for delivery to a patron. And finally, FCC, the insertion of audio narrated descriptions of a television program's key visual elements into natural pauses between the program's dialogue. Okay, so that's quite a few, and there are a lot of similar operative words. Obviously the first one from Section 508 is kind of stringing together multiple concepts kind of to form a cloud of acceptable, understanding of what we're talking about here when we talk about audio description. WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, is a very big, important group globally, and define a lot of things in this space, and are referenced in the Title II updates to the Americans with Disabilities Act, which I'm digging into a lot through work. And it says audio description is narration added to the soundtrack to describe important visual details that cannot be understood from the main soundtrack alone. So basically, yeah, I think it's word for word exactly what's in Section 508. And then they add a bunch of other notes that feel very similar to, it's just breaking out the 508 definition. I don't know. I think it's hitting on core core gaps that I feel in some of the other definitions. Kind of just talking about it as a thing that has already occurred and what it is doing, as opposed to what the visual made verbal kind of hits at, which is more of a process. I like the word, it says audio description is a means to inform individuals. That's kind of helpful, I think, is a means. It's a means, it's a container, it's a vessel, it's doing something, it's in service to, it's active, it's communicative. There's a sender and a receiver, and there's obviously all these definitions rely or are leaning very heavily into pre-recorded, video-based content. And I know, and you probably know if you're here at this channel, that audio description can be found in many more venues and places and avenues. So I guess I'll just end by saying I'm thinking about this. I think it's a core element of how I proceed with this work, is really delving into these kind of meta and philosophical elements of what's going on here. Like the handbook and all the authors contributing to it focused on translation, audiovisual translation, or AVT. I think that's heavily where my sentiments lay, where I would kind of hook a lot more weight into a translation, process and mode. But to say something like audio description is the translation of visuals into, I don't know, verbal encoding or something like that feels a little too stuffy. I don't know, for my tastes, maybe. But another word that has been coming to mind that I want to explore and look at is practice. Because I've been thinking about how that word shows up, and it's more often in an art context. And the other reference that I was going to pull into all this that I forgot to get when I started recording, so maybe I'll have to come back to it. I think I will. But also linked on the Audio Description Project's website is the master's thesis of a dude from California back in the day. They link to a copy of the Greg Fraser 1975 master's thesis called The Autobiography of Miss Jane Pittman, an all-audio adaptation of the teleplay for the blind and visually handicapped. And this work is in many instances referenced as the kind of like founding ideation of this notion of audio description. And it was happening out on the West Coast, but I know Joel Snyder and his colleagues were doing this work also on the East Coast, and then they learned of each other and started connecting the dots and putting together. Well, in one of Joel's trainings that I was able to be a part of, he pulled up a clip of Greg Fraser on the news, sort of like talking about what is this audio description thing. And he was really impressing upon the interviewer that it's easy to think of this as a process, as kind of like a piece of the cog. Maybe even he would agree with it's a process, but that it's a I don't know, it can be like an automatic or a machined process. And that's, seeing some things recently about companies trying to do this automatically made me think of this topic of what even is this? What are we doing? And the term practice kind of, to me, rings more heavily from traditions of art and humanities. And so the practice, so a practice is sort of like never done, and that's how I would have described back when I was doing karate more, practicing karate. It's kind of harder to think of it as like I did karate, or I guess I do karate, maybe karate, but practice. It's an evolving practice. It's a lifelong practice. It's and then there were lots of, when I was looking up sort of definitions of practice and how practice is used. There's a doctor's practice, and it's much more in that kind of there's a service element involved. You don't have a practice in a healthcare setting that doesn't involve anyone else. That's like just you. But that's kind of, maybe you could say like your yoga practice, right? That's maybe where this comes up. Could just be you, and make it true to your practice is what sometimes they would say, if a move is too difficult. But I think there's something there to this notion of practice, and maybe it's because I'm in early stages of all this and I feel like I'm practicing constantly. But I also feel like it might humanize some of what's going on beyond information. That audio description is information provided by a describer to become of a thing to become accessible. I don't know. I don't want to lose the in-service elements. I think I'm just trying to combine them and make them make a through line, a straight line. Albeit, I love the visual made verbal. I like the visual verbal, the alliteration there. So, anyways, these are some of my thoughts on defining audio description and how that might motivate and change what I'm doing in my practice, so to speak. But then also how it could help others. So, yeah. All right. Going to get back to these and do these every week so we can delve into more topics together. Or if I'm the only one out there shouting into the void, at least I'm putting things out there and trying to keep myself accountable to learning. That's the whole kind of point of this channel. But then again, if you're out there and you're listening and you find any of this fascinating, or have questions or ideas or challenge any of the things that I'm putting out there, put it in the comments or reach out. Thanks.